In November of 1941, the Kama River froze early. Barges loaded with lathes, gear-cutting machines, and crates of unfinished watch movements sat locked in ice a few miles short of the small Tatar town of Chistopol, unable to move another inch. German forces were closing on Moscow. The second Moscow watch factory had been ordered to evacuate east, and its equipment, its blueprints, and nearly 500 of its workers were now stranded on a frozen river in the middle of a Russian winter, freezing right alongside the machines that were supposed to save them. When the ice finally allowed movement again, local officials in Chistopol had nowhere to put any of it. The only building large enough was an abandoned distillery. So that is where a fully functioning precision watch factory was built from scratch, in the dead of a wartime winter, inside a building that used to make vodka. That was 1941. But the story of the watch that would eventually be called Vostok does not start on a frozen river in Tatarstan. It starts a decade earlier and half a world away, in a bankrupt watch factory in Canton, Ohio. The Hampton Watch Company had once been one of the largest watchmakers in the United States. Businessman John Duber had bought a controlling stake in the old Hampton Watch Company back in 1886 and relocated it to Canton, where his own case-making business already operated, and by 1888 the combined firm employed roughly 2,300 local residents, nearly 10% of the city's entire population according to that year's census. For a while, Canton was a genuine American watchmaking capital, turning out railroad-grade pocket watches trusted by engineers who could not afford to be even a minute off schedule. But changing fashions, the rise of the wristwatch over the pocket watch, and the crush of the Great Depression finished the company off. Ownership had already changed hands once in 1925, and the new owner drove the firm into bankruptcy within 2 years. In 1927, the company was in receivership, its equipment gathering dust, its skilled watchmakers out of work in a town that had once been built around them. And in 1929, halfway around the world, Joseph Stalin had a problem. The Soviet Union, in the middle of its first 5-year plan, wanted to industrialize everything, including something as small and precise as a wristwatch. There was just one issue. In 1928, the Soviet Union had no watchmaking industry at all, not a single domestic factory capable of producing a reliable timepiece. So Stalin's government sent a trading agency called Amtorg to go shopping in America, and Amtorg found exactly what it needed sitting bankrupt in Ohio. On April 26, 1929, Soviet representatives signed 2 purchase contracts for the entire contents of the Hampton factory, machinery, spare parts, and half-finished movements included. 3 Soviet specialists traveled to Canton to oversee the packing. 28 freight cars worth of lathes, dies, and precision tools were loaded onto a steamship and sent to Moscow, and 23 former Hampton employees, watchmakers, engravers, and technicians who had just lost their jobs to the Depression signed 1-year contracts to travel to the Soviet Union and personally teach Russian workers how to build watches from the ground up. Construction on the new factory in Moscow began in February of 1930. It was finished by June, an almost impossible timeline that only a command economy in a hurry could have forced through. By October 1st, workers were already at their benches. The Soviets called it the Day of the Hammer, and from that single frantic year of construction, the entire Soviet watch industry was born, built on American tools, American blueprints, and the expertise of men who had just watched their own company collapse and were now, for a contracted year of their lives, teaching their trade to the workers of a rival economic system on the other side of the planet. It worked more or less. Within a year, the first state watch factory was turning out pocket watches recognizably descended from Hampton's old size 16 pocket movement, still bearing traces of their Ohio ancestry in every gear and bridge. It became one of the showcase successes of Stalin's first 5-year plan, proof that the Soviet Union could build precision machinery on command. A sister facility, the second Moscow watch factory, was established to keep pace with demand. Watches meant something in the new Soviet state. They were handed out as awards for exceptional labor. They sat on the wrists of Red Army officers and factory foremen alike, small mechanical proof that the revolution could make things, not just seize them. Then came Operation Barbarossa, and everything that had been built in Moscow over the previous decade had to be torn apart and moved east before the German army arrived to take it. That is the frozen river you heard about a moment ago. The evacuation split the factory in 2. A skeleton crew stayed in Moscow to keep producing time fuses for artillery shells. The rest, roughly 500 people, including a hard core of 128 engineers and technicians, along with 170 railcars of equipment, were sent to Chistopol. Once the ice finally cleared and the machinery reached its destination, the factory was designated simply as Factory Number 835, and it made almost nothing you would call a watch for the next 2 years. It made magnetic detonator fuses, grenade components, and parachute release mechanisms. The precision that had gone into building fine movements went instead into building things that killed people, because that is what a total war economy demands of every factory it touches, watch factories included. And working inside that repurposed distillery was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with the German army at all. By the time the evacuation happened, Soviet labor law had already become one of the most punitive systems ever applied to an industrial workforce, and it only tightened as the war went on. A decree from June of 1940 had made unauthorized absence from work a criminal offense. Arriving more than 20 minutes late counted as absenteeism. Quitting your job without government permission, even asking about the possibility of quitting, could mean months of imprisonment. Between 1940 and 1952, roughly 10.9 million people across the Soviet Union were convicted of absenteeism or lateness, and another 2.77 million were convicted of leaving a job without authorization. Some estimates from later historians push the total consequences even higher, with millions eventually sent to labor camps or prison under the broader network of these laws. Over the years, the system remained in force. Managers who failed to report violations by their own workers faced criminal prosecution themselves, which meant the entire apparatus of Soviet industry, from the factory floor up through its supervisors, was bound together by the threat of punishment rather than the promise of wages alone. The workers who kept Factory 835 running through the winter of 1941 and 1942, many of them women and teenagers filling in for men who had been sent to the front, worked 12-hour shifts inside a converted distillery, under a legal system that treated a 20-minute delay the same way it treated a crime. There was no meaningful concept of calling in sick, no protected right to quit a job that had become unbearable. You showed up, or you answered for it in front of a tribunal. This is where the story of a cheap, chunky $40 Russian watch stops being a quirky footnote about frozen rivers and becomes something much darker. The Soviet Union did not build its watch industry, or nearly any of its industry, through free labor, freely given. It built it through a combination of genuine wartime sacrifice and a legal system willing to criminalize exhaustion. The people bent over workbenches assembling fuse mechanisms and, later, watch movements in Chistopol were not choosing that work the way a modern factory employee chooses a job. They were fulfilling a state obligation, and the penalty for failing to fulfill it was prison. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. By February of 1943, with the worst of the crisis past, the People's Commissariat for Mortar Weapons allowed the Chistopol factory to begin producing something other than munitions again. Its first civilian product was a men's wristwatch called the Kirovsky, and it marked the beginning of the factory's slow transformation from wartime emergency measure into a permanent institution. After the war, part of the original evacuated staff drifted back to Moscow, but a hard core of technicians stayed in Chistopol, and the town, isolated, purpose-built around this one industry, became the foundation on which everything that followed was constructed. The decision to relocate that factory to a small, forgettable river town rather than a proper industrial center had been made in a panic, under fire, with almost no planning behind it. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Chistopol would remain the beating heart of Russian watchmaking for the rest of the century and beyond. Military timepieces. Sister factories building the era's Stomansky Navigator's watches descended from the same original Amtorg purchased American tooling, painted their dials and hands with radium-based luminous paint so pilots and officers could read the time in the dark, the same radioactive compound that had already sickened and killed dial painters at watch factories in New Jersey and Illinois decades earlier under far less regulated conditions. Soviet industry, like American industry before it, had not yet reckoned with what that glowing paint was doing to the people applying it by hand. It would take until sometime in the 1960s for radium to be phased out across Soviet watchmaking in favor of the comparatively safer tritium, a switch driven as much by military health regulations trickling down from Moscow as by any consumer outcry, since ordinary Soviet citizens had little practical way to demand safer manufacturing from a state-run enterprise. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the factory built its identity around a specific philosophy that ran completely counter to Swiss watchmaking tradition. Soviet engineers could not consistently mill steel to the tight tolerances that Swiss and Japanese manufacturers relied on. So instead of fighting that limitation, they engineered around it, building movements with deliberately wide tolerances that could take a beating, freeze, get dropped, and keep running anyway. In 1952, the factory released its first shock-resistant, dust and waterproof watch, the Karma. In 1957, it introduced a wave of new civilian models. In 1962, its watches won a large gold medal at the Leipzig International Fair, a rare moment of Soviet consumer goods actually impressing an international audience. And in 1965 came the turning point that would define the brand for the next 60 years. The Chistopol watch factory became the official watch supplier to the USSR Ministry of Defense, and it released the Komandirsky, the commander's watch, purpose-built for Soviet officers who needed something that would survive a battlefield rather than complement a dinner jacket. 2 years later, in 1967, two Soviet engineers named Novikov and Belova solved a problem that should have been impossible for a factory with their limited manufacturing capability. They wanted to build a genuine dive watch capable of withstanding real depth, but their steel milling simply was not precise enough to hold a conventional screw-down caseback sealed with a thin rubber O-ring the way Swiss and Japanese divers did it, so they invented something else entirely. Instead of a screw-down back compressed against a slender gasket, they designed a bayonet-style caseback that dropped into the case and locked in place with a threaded ring, pressing down onto an unusually wide, flat rubber gasket that bore pure compression rather than sheer stress. The domed acrylic crystal was cut with a specific geometry that actually flattened and tightened under pressure instead of straining against it. And the crown itself was built in two pieces with intentional play so that the stem would never bend or snap the movement's delicate pinion under deep water pressure. The effect was strange and counterintuitive. The deeper this watch went, the tighter its seal became. Most watches fight water pressure. The Vostok Amphibia used it. At 200 meters of depth, that flat rubber gasket compresses by roughly 20 to 30% more than it does at the surface, actually strengthening the seal exactly when the watch needs it most. Because the gasket only ever experiences pure compression rather than the twisting shear force a conventional O-ring endures every time a caseback is screwed down, it never wears out and never needs replacing, something no Swiss dive watch of the era could claim. Engineers who could not out-machine the West simply out-thought the problem instead, and built a 200-meter dive watch out of geometry and rubber that Swiss engineers, with all their precision tooling, had never bothered to attempt. In 1969, the factory changed its name for the final time. A few years earlier, the Soviet Union had put Yuri Gagarin into orbit aboard a spacecraft called Vostok, meaning East, and the word had become saturated with national pride, modernity, and the sense that the Soviet system could outbuild anyone on Earth. The Chistopol factory adopted the name for itself, and every watch it made from that point forward, military or civilian, carried the Vostok brand. A watch named after a spaceship, assembled by a factory that had been built inside a converted vodka distillery, using tooling looted from a bankrupt company in Ohio. Almost nothing about that origin story is what the name implies, and that gap between image and reality would follow the brand for the rest of its existence. Vostok watches spread quietly across the Iron Curtain throughout the 1950s and 60s, exported under the anglicized name Vostok, dials printed in English for foreign buyers who had no idea the brand's entire technical lineage traced back to a defunct American factory. And then, in a twist almost nobody could have predicted, the Cold War adversary's field watch ended up on American wrists. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the United States military reportedly ordered a batch of Komandirsky watches for troops deployed to the region, drawn by their reputation for being nearly indestructible and dirt cheap to replace if lost or damaged in the field. The exact scale of that order is disputed among collectors and historians, and precise military procurement records from that period are difficult to verify, but the underlying fact is beyond dispute. A watch engineered specifically to outfit Soviet officers for a war against the West ended up strapped to the wrists of American soldiers fighting a war of their own less than a year before the Soviet Union that built it ceased to exist. The collapse came fast. State orders evaporated. Domestic demand cratered along with the entire Soviet consumer economy. Vostok, like nearly every state-owned Soviet enterprise, had to reinvent itself almost overnight or die. In 1993, the factory was privatized, and that same year it signed an unusual deal with a Swiss trading company called BN Trading for roughly 500,000 watches a year in exclusive Western distribution. A related Swiss firm calling itself Ostwok even sold the exact same. Russian-made movements under leather straps and a name deliberately designed to sound Swiss, hiding the watch's Soviet origins from Western European buyers who might have hesitated to buy something stamped made in Russia in the years right after the Cold War ended. The company that had once symbolized Soviet industrial pride was now quietly laundering its own national identity to move product in the West. The 1990s and 2000s were not kind to the factory. quality control slipped badly amid the chaos of the post-Soviet economy. The brand name Vostok, being simply the Russian word for East, turned out to be nearly impossible to trademark and protect, and counterfeiters in Western Europe, the United States, and eventually China flooded the market with fakes and near copies that undercut the genuine product and occasionally damaged its reputation when they broke. In 2010, the original factory entity went bankrupt outright and had to be reorganized into several smaller companies operating under common ownership, a corporate restructuring that would have been unthinkable to the engineers who built the Komandirsky as an instrument of state military policy, and yet the watches kept finding new admirers. As Soviet-era vintage collecting grew into a genuine global hobby through the 2000s and 2010s, the Amphibia's strange compression case engineering, once dismissed by Western enthusiasts as a crude workaround for poor Soviet manufacturing, started to be recognized for what it actually was, a genuinely clever piece of engineering born entirely out of necessity. Collectors began calling it the poor man's Panerai. It showed up on wrists in films, including a memorable appearance strapped to Bill Murray's character in The Life Aquatic. It became a favorite of watch modders precisely because its simple in-house automatic movement, still built by hand in Chistopol to this day, was cheap enough to experiment on without fear of ruining something expensive, and a small industry of aftermarket cases, dials and hands grew up specifically around customizing them. Prices on the second-hand vintage market have reportedly climbed more than fivefold over just the last few years, as availability tightens and a new generation of collectors discovers a brand that was, for most of its existence, virtually unknown outside the Soviet bloc, sold at a fraction of what any comparable automatic diver from Switzerland or Japan would cost. Then, in February of 2022, geopolitics caught up with the brand one more time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought a wave of international sanctions that hit ordinary commerce far beyond tanks and oil. Vostok's Swiss and German distributors began posting notices apologizing to customers for payment processing failures, as PayPal, major credit card networks, and international shipping routes cut ties with Russian businesses almost overnight. Russian postal services could no longer reliably ship watches directly to European buyers. A brand that had spent 30 years quietly rebuilding trust with Western collectors after the Cold War found itself, once again, caught in the crossfire of a conflict between Russia and the West, its supply chain strangled not by design, but by sanctions regimes it had absolutely nothing to do with. Today, the Vostok factory in Chistopol, still one of the very few remaining Soviet-era watch factories left operating anywhere in Russia, stands on essentially the same footprint it occupied when it was hastily assembled inside that converted distillery more than 80 years ago. It still produces its own movements in-house, calibers descended in a fairly direct engineering line from tooling shipped out of Canton, Ohio. In 1930, a rarity in a watch industry where most affordable brands simply buy movements from a handful of large Swiss or Japanese suppliers. The Amphibia still uses the same compression case Novikov and Belova designed in 1967. The Komandirsky still carries the silhouette of a watch. Built for Soviet officers who needed something that could survive a war. And somewhere out there right now, on the wrist of a collector who may have no idea any of this history exists, ticks a $40 to $70 watch that traces its lineage through a bankrupt American factory, a frozen river evacuation, a converted vodka distillery, a Soviet spacecraft, a Gulf War supply order, and a set of international sanctions, all compressed into a single humble object that most people would glance at and assume was simply cheap. The frozen river in November of 1941 nearly ended the whole story before it began. Instead, it became the reason the story exists at all. A factory improvised in desperation, inside a building meant for making vodka, using machinery bought from a company that had already failed once, went on to outfit a superpower's military, accidentally arm its Cold War rival, survive the collapse of the country that built it, and end up strapped to the wrists of watch collectors on the opposite side of the planet who paid more attention to the ice on the Kama River than most historians ever have. Not bad for a watch nobody was supposed to remember. If this story changed the way you think about the watch on your own wrist, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of Vostok's history surprised you the most, and smash that like button so more people can find this.